I first noticed the small black box under my car on a quiet Tuesday morning. The kind of morning that feels so ordinary you don't expect anything to be wrong. The sun was just starting to warm the driveway, and I had stepped outside with my coffee mug still in my hand, looking for the set of keys I had dropped the night before. At 67, I've learned that little routines matter. They keep life steady. I bent down beside the driver's side door, brushing a few dry leaves away from the pavement, when something dark caught my eye beneath the frame of the car. At first I thought it was just road debris. Piece of plastic, maybe. But when I leaned closer, I saw that it was attached neatly against the metal with a magnet. A small black box about the size of a deck of cards. Clean. Deliberate. Placed there by someone who meant it to stay. I didn't touch it right away. I just crouched there for a moment, feeling the faint warmth of the engine from the drive home the night before. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked somewhere down the block. For a strange second I wondered if maybe it had always been there and I'd simply never noticed. But that didn't feel right. I've owned that car for nearly 12 years. A silver Toyota Camry with more grocery store miles than highway ones. I know every little scratch on the doors and every rattle it makes in winter. I would have seen this before. I set my coffee on the hood and looked closer. The box had a small seam along the side, and a tiny blinking light no bigger than a pinhead. Red. Slow. Steady. My first thought was that it might be some kind of mechanical device from the auto shop. Maybe something they forgot to remove during my last oil change. But even as that thought crossed my mind, another memory surfaced quietly behind it. Daniel asking me a strange question last Thursday night. "You were at the grocery store for almost an hour?" he had said from the kitchen table. I remember laughing and telling him the line was long. Then there was the time the week before that, when he casually mentioned the little cafe downtown. "Did you enjoy your coffee?" he asked as if he had been there with me. At the time I didn't think much of it. Married couples talk about their days. It's normal. But standing there in the driveway, staring at that blinking red light, those conversations felt different somehow. Too precise. Too certain. I reached under the car and gently pulled the box free. The magnet released with a soft click. It was heavier than I expected, solid and well-made. Not something that had fallen off a truck or gotten stuck there by accident. I turned it over in my hands. No logo. No label. Just smooth black plastic and that quiet blinking light. For a long moment I simply stood there, holding it, listening to the breeze move through the trees in my yard. A strange calm settled over me then. Not panic. Not anger. Just the slow, careful feeling that something in my life had shifted slightly out of place. I placed the device on the passenger seat and drove to the local garage a mile down the road. It's the same place I've gone for years. A small shop with 3 bays and a faded American flag painted on the wall. Frank, the mechanic, has been working on my car since before my husband retired. When I walked inside, he looked up from his workbench and smiled the way people do when they've known you for a long time. "Morning, Margaret," he said. "What can I do for you today?" I held up the little black box. "Frank," I said calmly, "I found this under my car this morning." He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped closer, taking the device from me. For a moment he turned it over slowly, studying it. Then he glanced up at me with a look that was polite but slightly puzzled. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "did you install this tracker yourself?" Frank did not look frightened when he asked the question. He looked confused. That was what stayed with me the most. Mechanics see all kinds of things under cars. Loose parts. Road damage. Sometimes strange devices left behind by previous owners. But the tone in his voice told me something important before he even finished the sentence. This was not something normal. I gave a small shake of my head. "No, Frank," I said calmly. "I did not install anything like that." He studied the device again, turning it slowly between his fingers. The red light continued to blink at the same steady rhythm, patient and quiet. Finally, he placed it on the workbench beside him. "Well," he said after a moment, "that is definitely a GPS tracker." The words were spoken casually, but they landed heavier than I expected. A GPS tracker. Not debris. Not a forgotten shop tool. Something designed to follow a vehicle wherever it goes. I leaned lightly against the counter and watched the little blinking light across the room. "Is that common?" I asked. Frank shrugged the way people do when they are trying not to alarm you. Sometimes companies use them on fleet vehicles, delivery trucks, work cars, but on a personal car. He paused and lifted one eyebrow slightly. That usually means somebody wants to know where the vehicle is going. I nodded slowly. My hands remained folded calmly in front of me, but my thoughts were already moving through the last few weeks like pages turning in a quiet book. Daniel asking about the grocery store. Daniel mentioning the cafe downtown. Daniel casually remarking one evening that I had spent longer than usual at the library. At the time I had assumed he was simply paying attention. Husbands notice things sometimes. But now the pattern looked different. Much sharper. Frank must have noticed the change in my expression because his voice softened slightly. "Did you want me to remove it permanently?" he asked. "I can dispose of it for you." For a few seconds I did not answer. I simply looked at the small black device sitting on the metal workbench. The blinking light continued its slow rhythm. Patient. Observing. Waiting. I realized something then that surprised even me. I was not angry. Not yet. What I felt instead was curiosity. The kind that appears when a puzzle finally reveals its outline but not its solution. Someone had placed that device under my car. Someone wanted to know exactly where I went each day. And if my quiet suspicions were correct, that someone already believed the tracker was still there doing its job. Frank waited politely while I thought. The shop radio played softly in the background. Outside, a pickup truck rolled past on the road. Finally I reached forward and picked up the device again. It felt solid in my palm. Deliberate. Designed to stay hidden. "Actually," I said slowly, "I think I will hold on to it for now." Frank looked slightly surprised but did not argue. "All right," he said. "Just be careful with it. Whoever installed it might notice if it stops transmitting." I smiled faintly at that thought. "That is exactly what I was thinking about," I replied. I slipped the tracker into my purse and thanked him before walking back out into the morning sunlight. My silver Camry was still parked where I had left it, quiet and ordinary as always. Nothing about it suggested that someone had been quietly watching its movements. I sat behind the wheel for a moment without starting the engine. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. The same houses, the same trees, the same calm street. But something inside my mind had shifted slightly, a realization settling into place piece by piece. If Daniel had placed that tracker under my car, then he believed it was still there. And if he believed it was still there, then somewhere perhaps on a phone or a computer, he was watching a little map that showed where I was driving. I started the engine slowly and pulled out of the garage parking lot. I did not head home right away. Instead I drove toward the small coffee shop downtown where I sometimes spent quiet mornings reading. As I stopped at a red light, I glanced at the purse on the passenger seat where the tracker now rested silently. Frank had been right about one thing. Whoever installed it would notice if it suddenly stopped transmitting. That meant the device still needed to travel somewhere. Just not under my car anymore. I drove slowly through downtown, letting the morning traffic carry me along while my thoughts settled into something clearer than suspicion. The tracker rested quietly inside my purse on the passenger seat, its tiny red light blinking at the same calm rhythm as before. Somewhere, someone believed that device was still attached under my car. Somewhere, a little digital map was quietly updating my location every few seconds. The idea should have made me feel uneasy, but instead it gave me a strange sense of control. Whoever had placed that tracker had done so with confidence. They believed they were the only one watching. They believed I would never notice. That assumption was the first mistake. Parked outside the coffee shop and sat for a moment before stepping out of the car. The morning air carried the warm smell of roasted beans and fresh bread from inside the cafe. It was the same small place I had visited many times over the years, a quiet corner with wide windows that looked out onto the street. I ordered a cup of black coffee and took my usual seat near the glass, setting my purse gently on the chair beside me. The tracker continued blinking softly inside it, patient and loyal to whoever had placed it. I imagined Daniel sitting somewhere across town with his phone in his hand, glancing at a small map from time to time. Perhaps he believed I was shopping, or meeting someone, or simply running errands like any other Tuesday morning. That thought brought a faint smile to my face. Daniel and I had been married for 42 years. Long enough for most couples to know each other completely. At least that was what I had always believed. But in the past few months something about him had changed. Small questions. Small comments. Nothing dramatic. Just little moments that felt slightly out of place. At the time I dismissed them as curiosity or boredom. Retirement leaves a lot of empty hours in a person's day. But now those moments lined up in my mind with quiet precision. Each one pointing to the same possibility. When I finished my coffee, I walked back outside and stood on the sidewalk for a moment watching the cars pass along the street. Delivery vans. Office workers. A city bus stopping at the corner. Everything looked ordinary. Predictable. I reached into my purse and felt the smooth plastic of the tracker beneath my fingers. The blinking light continued patiently, sending its signal to whoever was watching. Frank had said something earlier that stayed with me. Whoever installed it might notice if it stops transmitting. That meant the device needed to keep moving. It needed to continue its quiet little journey across the map. Just not with me. I began walking slowly down the block, my eyes moving casually over the row of parked vehicles along the curb. A red pickup truck. A gray sedan. A delivery van with the company name painted on the side. And then I saw it. A black and white police cruiser parked neatly. In front of the courthouse steps about 50 yards ahead. The engine was off and the street around it was calm. No one seemed to be paying attention to it. For a moment I simply stood there, studying the car the same way someone studies the final piece of a puzzle. The idea formed quietly in my mind, so simple that it almost made me laugh. If Daniel was watching a map, he expected my car to keep moving through town. If the signal suddenly appeared somewhere unexpected, he would certainly notice. I glanced around the street again. A few pedestrians were passing by, minding their own business. No one was looking in my direction. I walked calmly toward the cruiser, the tracker still resting in my purse. My heart was steady. My steps were slow and ordinary. When I reached the police vehicle, I crouched briefly beside the rear tire as if adjusting the strap on my shoe. My hand slipped into my purse and closed around the small black device. The magnet on the back felt cool against my fingers. In one smooth motion I reached beneath the edge of the cruiser's frame and pressed the tracker firmly against the metal. The magnet caught instantly with a soft click. I stood up, brushed an imaginary speck of dust from my knee, and continued walking down the sidewalk without looking back. The tracker's little red light would continue blinking exactly as it had all morning. Only now, the car it followed would belong to someone else entirely. I did not hurry as I walked away from the police cruiser. The sidewalk stretched quietly ahead of me, the courthouse steps behind me growing smaller with every step. The tracker was no longer in my purse. It was no longer connected to my car. Instead it sat firmly beneath the frame of a police vehicle that would almost certainly begin moving at some point during the day. That thought settled into my mind with a calm satisfaction. Whoever was watching the signal would soon begin to notice something unusual. I reached my Camry and slid into the driver's seat, resting my hands lightly on the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine. The car felt the same as it always had. Familiar. Reliable. A quiet companion for countless grocery trips and library visits over the years. Yet now it carried a secret that only I understood. I pulled away from the curb and drove home at an easy pace, following the same route I had taken hundreds of times before. Trees lined the neighborhood streets, their branches swaying gently in the light breeze. A man down the block was watering his lawn. A school bus passed in the opposite direction, bright yellow under the clear sky. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. When I reached my driveway I parked the car and stepped inside the house, setting my purse on the kitchen counter. The clock above the stove read 10:30 in the morning. Daniel would still be at the hardware store where he volunteered a few hours each week. His routine rarely changed. Tuesdays and Thursdays from 9 until noon. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down at the small table near the window. For a while I simply watched the quiet movement of the neighborhood outside. A woman walking her dog. A delivery truck stopping 2 houses down. Time passed slowly, the way it often does when you are waiting for something you cannot see yet. I wondered when the police cruiser would begin moving. Perhaps an officer would return from the courthouse and drive across town to another assignment. Perhaps it would sit there for hours before anyone touched it. Either way, the tracker would follow wherever that vehicle went. And somewhere Daniel would be watching a map that made less and less sense with every passing mile. The idea brought another small smile to my face. Daniel had always believed he was very clever with technology. He enjoyed explaining new applications and devices to me as though I had never used a telephone before. Over the years I had learned to nod politely and let him talk. But technology works the same for everyone. It only does exactly what you tell it to do. Around 11:15 my phone buzzed softly on the kitchen table. A text message. I picked it up and looked at the screen. It was from Daniel. The message was simple. Are you in town today? I read it twice before setting the phone down again. There was no accusation in the words. Just curiosity. But curiosity has a tone when you know the person who wrote it. I waited a few minutes before replying. No, I typed slowly. I came home after coffee. The 3 small dots appeared almost immediately on the screen as Daniel began typing again. Then they disappeared. Then they appeared once more. Finally another message arrived. Strange, he wrote. I thought you were near the courthouse. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the quiet street. Somewhere across town, a police cruiser was beginning its daily patrol with a small black tracker attached beneath its frame. And somewhere else, my husband was staring at a digital map that told him his wife had suddenly decided to spend the morning driving around the courthouse district for no clear reason at all. I took another sip of water and placed the phone back on the table. I did not feel the need to explain anything further. The map would continue moving soon enough, and when it did, Daniel would have many more questions than he had answers. The house remained quiet after Daniel's message, the kind of quiet that settles into the walls when something unseen is slowly unfolding somewhere else. I left my phone on the kitchen table and began moving through the small routines of the afternoon the same way I always did. I rinsed the coffee cup in the sink. I folded the dish towel beside the counter. Outside, the sunlight had grown brighter, casting long clean lines across the living room floor. Everything felt normal. And that was exactly the point. If Daniel was still watching the map connected to that tracker, he would see something that made less and less sense with every passing minute. Around 11:45 my phone buzzed again. Another message. I walked back to the table and looked at the screen. Margaret, did you drive somewhere else? He had written. The words were polite, but the timing told me more than the message itself. The police cruiser must have started moving. I pictured it leaving the courthouse lot, pulling into traffic, rolling slowly through downtown streets while the little black tracker beneath it continued sending its quiet signal. Somewhere Daniel was watching that signal travel farther and farther away from where he believed my car should be. I sat down and typed my reply carefully. No, I wrote. I have been home for a while. I placed the phone down again and waited. This time the response took longer. Nearly 5 minutes passed before another message appeared. That is strange, Daniel wrote. Your car is moving. I could almost hear the uncertainty behind the words. Daniel had always trusted what he saw on a screen. If a map said a car was driving across town, he believed it. If an application showed a location pin moving along a street, he assumed the information was correct. Technology gave people a false sense of certainty sometimes. They forget that machines only follow the instructions they are given. I stood up and walked to the window again, watching the quiet neighborhood while Daniel's digital map told him a completely different story. Somewhere the police cruiser was probably heading toward another part of the city. Perhaps an officer had just started the afternoon patrol. Perhaps the car was stopping at traffic lights or turning onto unfamiliar streets. With every turn, Daniel's confusion would be growing. At 12:10 my phone rang. Not a message this time. A call. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once then twice before answering. Hello, I said calmly. On the other end I could hear the faint background noise of the hardware store. Tools shifting. A door opening somewhere. Daniel spoke quickly. Margaret, where are you right now? The question arrived too fast, too direct. I leaned lightly against the counter and looked out at the quiet street. I told you, I replied gently. I am at home. There was a short pause. I imagined him staring down at his phone, watching the little signal moving steadily across the map. That cannot be right, he said slowly. Because your car is downtown again. I allowed a moment of silence to pass between us. Not long enough to feel dramatic. Just long enough for the idea to begin settling into his thoughts. Is it? I said quietly. On the other end of the call, Daniel did not answer right away. I could almost hear his mind working through possibilities, each one more confusing than the last. The map would still be moving. The signal would still be blinking. And the car carrying that signal would belong to someone who had absolutely no idea it was being followed. I rested my hand on the edge of the kitchen table and spoke again with the same calm tone I had used for 42 years of marriage. Daniel, I said, softly, why exactly do you think my car is downtown? Daniel did not answer my question right away. The silence on the phone stretched just a little longer than normal, the kind of pause that appears when someone suddenly realizes they have said too much. In the background I could hear the faint sound of a cash register, and the low murmur of voices from the hardware store. Daniel cleared his throat before speaking again. I just meant that maybe you drove back out after your coffee, he said, his voice trying to sound casual. Maybe the signal on my phone is wrong. I did not respond immediately. Instead I walked slowly across the kitchen, running my fingers lightly along the edge of the counter while I looked out toward the quiet street. The afternoon sun had climbed higher now, bright against the trees across the road. A delivery truck rolled past the house and continued toward the next block. Everything outside remained calm and ordinary. On the other end of the phone, Daniel was waiting. What signal? I asked gently. The question hung between us like a small object that had suddenly appeared in the middle of the room. Daniel inhaled softly. Nothing, he said quickly. It is just an application I tried. Something that shows vehicle locations. I nodded even though he could not see me. The explanation was exactly what I expected. Technology again. Something convenient. Something harmless, at least in his mind. That sounds useful, I replied. But I think your application may be confused. Another pause followed. I imagined Daniel looking down at his screen again, watching the little location icon continue its quiet journey through streets that I was not actually driving. Perhaps the police cruiser had reached another part of town by now. Perhaps it had stopped at a traffic light or turned into a parking lot somewhere. Every movement would look like my car traveling farther away from home. Finally Daniel spoke again, more slowly this time. Margaret, he said, can you do something for me? Of course, I replied. Can you step outside and check if your car is still in the driveway? I almost laughed, but I kept my voice calm. Daniel, I said softly, I am looking at it right now through the window. The Camry is exactly where I parked it this morning. I heard a faint exhale. From the other end of the line. It was the sound people make when the explanation they expected suddenly disappears. That is strange, he murmured. I allowed the silence to stretch again before speaking. Daniel, I said carefully, why would your application think my car is somewhere else? For a moment there was no reply at all. I imagined him staring at the screen, watching the signal move farther and farther across the map while the truth of the situation slowly began forming in his thoughts. The tracker was still working. The signal was still broadcasting its location. But it was no longer attached to the vehicle he believed it was following. Finally Daniel spoke again, his voice lower now. Maybe the device is malfunctioning, he said. Sometimes those things are not accurate. I looked down at the phone in my hand and smiled faintly. Those things. I repeated. What kind of device are you talking about? The words left my mouth quietly, but I could feel the weight behind them. On the other end of the line Daniel did not answer. The silence lasted several seconds longer than before. Somewhere across the city, a police cruiser continued driving through traffic with a small black tracker firmly attached beneath its frame. And somewhere else, my husband was beginning to realize that whatever he had hidden under my car was no longer where he left it. Daniel remained silent long enough that I could hear the faint hum of the store lights through the phone. It was the kind of silence that does not happen in ordinary conversations. It happens when someone is searching for a version of the truth that will not reveal too much. Finally he spoke again, but his voice had changed slightly. The confidence from earlier was gone. Margaret, he said carefully, maybe I should come home early today. I walked slowly across the kitchen and rested my hand on the back of one of the chairs. Outside, the street remained calm, the same quiet neighborhood we had lived in for nearly 3 decades. That is not necessary, I replied gently. You usually finish at noon. There was a short pause. I think I will come home anyway, he said. I could almost picture him standing there beside the counter at the hardware store, staring at the screen in his hand while the location signal continued moving through streets that had nothing to do with me. Somewhere across town the police cruiser was still traveling its route. Every block it passed would make Daniel's confusion grow. "All right," I said calmly. "Drive safely." We ended the call without another word. I placed the phone back on the kitchen table and stood quietly for a moment, listening to the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Noon arrived slowly. A few minutes later I heard the familiar sound of Daniel's pickup truck turning into the driveway. The engine stopped. A car door closed. Then the front door opened and he stepped inside. I was still standing near the kitchen table when he walked in. For a brief moment we simply looked at each other. Daniel held his phone in his hand, the screen still glowing. "Margaret," he said, trying to sound calm, "can we talk for a minute?" I nodded toward the chair across from me. "Of course." He sat down but did not relax. His eyes kept drifting back to the phone screen, as though the moving signal there might suddenly explain everything. I poured a glass of water and placed it in front of him before sitting down as well. "What exactly is happening with that application you mentioned?" I asked quietly. Daniel rubbed his forehead with one hand. "It is nothing important," he said quickly. "Just something I was testing." I studied his face for a moment. After 42 years of marriage you learn the small differences between a casual answer and a careful one. This was the second kind. "Testing what?" I asked. He hesitated again. The silence stretched across the table between us. Finally he held up the phone so I could see the screen. On it was a simple map with a small blinking moving slowly through the city streets. "This," he said. I looked at the screen for a few seconds. The little dot was traveling along a road near the northern part of town now, several miles away from our neighborhood. "That looks like quite a drive," I said calmly. Daniel nodded slowly. "That is the problem," he replied. "Because according to this, your car has been moving around the city for the past hour." I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands together. "But you just saw it in the driveway," I said. Daniel nodded again. "Yes." His voice sounded tighter now. "Which means something is very wrong with that tracker." The word slipped out before he could stop it. "Tracker." The room became very quiet. Daniel realized what he had said a second later and looked up at me quickly. I did not raise my voice. I did not react with anger. I simply held his gaze and asked the one question that had been waiting since this morning. "Daniel," I said softly, "why did you put a tracker under my car?" Daniel did not answer immediately. The question sat between us like something fragile that neither of us wanted to touch too quickly. He lowered the phone slowly until it rested on the kitchen table, the screen still glowing with that small blinking, moving steadily across the map. For a moment he looked down at it, then back at me. I noticed how his shoulders had stiffened, how his usual calm posture had tightened in a way I had not seen in years. "Margaret," he began, his voice careful, "it is not what it looks like." I listened without interrupting. After 42 years of marriage I had heard that sentence before, though never quite in a moment like this. "Then tell me what it is," I said quietly. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck and let out a long breath. "I just wanted to know where you were going," he admitted finally. The words came out slower than the others, like something heavy being placed down. I studied his face, searching for the man I had spent most of my life beside. "Why?" I asked. He hesitated again, looking down at the map on his phone as if it might help him find an answer. The little dot continued moving north across the city streets. "Because things have been different lately," he said after a moment. "You leave the house more often. You stay out longer. I thought maybe—" He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. I did not raise my voice. I did not react the way some people might expect. Instead I simply asked the question that had been forming quietly since morning. "You thought maybe I was hiding something from you?" Daniel looked up quickly. "No," he said, though the hesitation before the word told its own story. "I just wanted to be sure." The room felt very still around us. The kitchen clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. I leaned forward slightly and folded my hands together on the table. "Daniel," I said gently, "after 42 years, you decided the best way to trust your wife was to secretly follow her car." He did not answer. His eyes dropped back to the phone screen again, watching the signal move farther away. Where is it now? I asked. Daniel glanced at the map. Near the North District, he said quietly. It has been driving all over the city. I nodded slowly. That must be confusing. Another silence followed. I could see the thoughts forming behind his eyes now, the slow realization that something in this situation did not add up the way he expected. The tracker was still sending a signal. The map was still updating its location. But the car he had attached it to was sitting in our driveway exactly where I had parked it hours ago. Finally he looked up at me again. Margaret, he said cautiously, did you find something under your car today? The question arrived carefully, like someone testing thin ice before taking another step. I allowed a small pause before answering. Yes, I said calmly. His expression tightened immediately. You did, he asked. What was it? I held his gaze across the table. A small black device, I replied. About the size of a deck of cards. It had a magnet on the back and a little red light that blinked every few seconds. Daniel's face lost a bit of its color as I described it. For a moment he said nothing at all. The map on his phone continued moving quietly across the city. Then he asked the question that finally connected everything together. Margaret, he said slowly, where did you put it? Daniel's question lingered in the quiet kitchen. Where did you put it? He asked again, his voice slower this time, as if he was already afraid of the answer. I rested my hands calmly on the table and looked at him for a moment before speaking. After 42 years together, I knew exactly how Daniel reacted when something slipped out of his control. His eyes moved between my face and the glowing screen of his phone, where the small dot continued its steady path across the city. It had reached a long avenue near the Northern District now, several miles from our neighborhood. I did not throw it away, I said gently. Daniel nodded quickly, almost impatiently. I know that, he said. If you had, the signal would have stopped. I tilted my head slightly, studying him. You seem very familiar with how it works. He did not answer that. Instead he tapped the screen of his phone once more, zooming in on the moving map. Margaret, he said quietly, that device is still traveling. I followed his gaze to the screen. The small blinking dot moved along another street, turning at an intersection I recognized from downtown. Yes, I said calmly. I noticed. Daniel looked up at me again, confusion and realization slowly mixing across his expression. But your car is here, he said. Which means... He stopped mid-sentence, the thought finally catching up with him. I allowed a small moment of silence to pass before answering his question. I moved it, I said simply. Daniel blinked once. Moved it, he repeated. Where? I leaned back slightly in my chair, keeping my voice calm and steady. This morning after I found it, I explained. I drove downtown for coffee. When I left the cafe, there was a police cruiser parked outside the courthouse. Daniel's face tightened almost immediately. Margaret, he began. I continued speaking in the same quiet tone. I thought the tracker should continue traveling, I said. Otherwise whoever placed it might become suspicious. Daniel's eyes widened slightly as the meaning settled in. On the phone screen the signal continued moving down another street, still several miles away. So I attached it under the police cruiser. I finished. The words hung in the air between us. For a moment Daniel simply stared at me. Then his gaze dropped quickly back to the phone screen again. The map continued updating as the cruiser drove somewhere across town. You attached it to a police vehicle? He said slowly. Yes, I replied. It seemed like the safest place for it to travel. Daniel ran a hand across his forehead, his thoughts racing now. I could see him calculating possibilities, imagining the tracker being discovered, imagining questions he might not be prepared to answer. Margaret, he said carefully, if that officer notices it, I shrugged lightly. Then they will probably wonder who put it there, I said. The silence returned again, heavier this time. The kitchen clock ticked quietly above the stove. Daniel stared at the phone screen while the little continued moving through the city streets, still faithfully reporting its location. Finally he looked up at me again. The confusion in his expression had been replaced by something more complicated now. Embarrassment. Regret. perhaps even a little fear. "You did not have to do that," he said quietly. I held his gaze across the table. "Daniel," I said softly, "you did not have to put a tracker under my car." He did not reply. Instead, he slowly turned the phone screen toward the table and let out a long breath. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees along our street. Everything beyond our kitchen remained peaceful and ordinary. But something between us had shifted. Trust does not break with loud arguments. Sometimes it simply moves, the way that small blinking signal had moved across Daniel's map all afternoon, traveling farther and farther away from where he thought it would be.